Um, Thank you for tuning in today to hear about our process of developing a conservation management plan for the Pennsylvania Hospital. I'm Starr Herr-Cardillo, and I'm a graduate of the Master's Program in Historic Preservation, class of 2017. And I'm here with Weitzman Lecturer Kecia Fong, who's managing the project alongside me, who graduated from the same program in 1999. And we're also joined by Associate Professor Aaron Wunsch, who is our architectural historian and who teaches in the Historic Preservation program, along with Stacey Peeples, who's the lead archivist and curator for the Pennsylvania Hospital, and who's been working closely alongside us during this process. So in 2020, the hospital engaged the Center for Architectural Conservation at the Weitzman School of Design to undertake a year-long study of the historic Pine Street building, grounds, and collections to create a conservation management plan, or what we'll call a CMP. And we like to refer to the CMP as a living document because in its most straightforward sense, it's really meant to serve as a very practical and updatable tool that outlines the significance of the historic site and helps provide specific informed guidance for future management and decision-making. So over the course of the last year and then some, because our project officially kicked off in March of 2020 and quickly became somewhat complicated by COVID. We've been conducting archival research, doing extensive stakeholder interviews, and working closely with our colleagues at the hospital to develop an understanding of those values that inform the place, the physical conditions of the site and building, and better understanding the programmatic and management goals. That will all inform the CMP and the guidelines that we develop. But I think it's really important to point out that this process of kind of consolidating and gathering all of this information and pulling it together often raises many more questions than it answers. And I think that's kind of what we want to play around with today, is use this panel as an opportunity to share some of those questions we've come up against, ideas we're circling, and discuss some of the themes that have emerged through this process so far. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the site for any of those who might not be familiar with it, and then we'll open things up for a discussion amongst our panelists. And feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation in the chat. I will keep an eye on it. If there's anything immediately relevant, I'll try to answer it, and any other questions we'll save and address during Q&A session at the end. And this is my disclaimer, is we're going to be using images and archival material that we found to kind of prompt our discussion. And when it came time to selecting that material, we had a little bit of trouble editing it down. So we recognize there's a fair amount there, and we're all pretty enthusiastic about it. So we'll try to stick to our time frame and keep things moving along. But so the image you're looking at, this is really how I first encountered the Pennsylvania Hospital, which we know was founded in 1751 by Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Thomas Bond, known as the oldest continuously operating hospital in the United States. But I saw it from this vantage point, from the top of a double-decker tour bus, kind of shortly after I moved to Philadelphia from Arizona. And, of course, the tour guide is pointing out the dome and describing surgery and pre-anesthesia days. And I like remembering that first impression because it really stuck with me, and it felt like such an intriguing and compelling place. And I remember that I really wanted to make sure that, someday I got to see inside. So the Pine Building is a National Historic Landmark, and the east and west wings are now used primarily as office and administrative spaces, but there really are some incredible interior spaces in it as well. Next slide. So you enter the center building, which was completed in 1804, to the Great Court, which has these wonderful Portuguese flat tile floors, this grand staircase. And this space now houses a conference room located in the former apothecary of the hospital and the executive offices. Next slide. And then on the second floor, you have the historic medical library, another incredible space that's also used still for conferences and meetings, displaying some of the collections, and of course for storing a large portion of the hospital's collection of books and historic medical texts. Next slide. And then on the third floor, you have the Surgical Amphitheater, which was restored in 1976 for the bicentennial, had formerly been kind of repurposed as a staff and physician's lounge, but is now, one of the most iconic spaces that people associate with the building. Next slide. But it's important to remember that just on the other side of all of these great historic spaces and that kind of iconic front lawn, there's a completely modern hospital. So for more than 250 years, the Pennsylvania hospitals really remained at the cutting edge of medical knowledge, education, and innovation. Next slide. And this image really illustrates that, and we'll show you some earlier versions of the same phenomenon a little bit later. But the entire north side of the campus, which we're talking about, the block between 8th Street, 9th Street, Pine and Spruce, has always been modernized and updated to offer state-of-the-art care. So we're going to frame today's discussion around kind of 3 key themes that have come up a lot through this process. The first one is understanding this relationship between the evolution of the hospital campus and how it relates to changing ideas about public health and advancements in technology. The second is this intersection of art, science, medicine, and the humanities, and kind of, the interconnectivity of this early network of knowledge sharing happening in Philadelphia and across the world. And the last theme is looking at broadening the narrative. So moving a bit beyond the story of the founding fathers and kind of that top-down institutional history that's typically been told. Yeah, so with that, we have our panelists here, and we can go ahead and get started. Next slide. Our first image is this crop of the 1796 plan of the city of Philadelphia and its environs by John Hills. That really illustrates how in the 18th century, the hospital was really located at the periphery of the city. And it wasn't until later that the city kind of grew up around it. We'll use that as a launching point because that decision was very much intentional.
Right, so just to make sure that everyone knows where the hospital is, it's framed in red, sort of at the center near the bottom of your screen. And so when the hospital was founded, it really was at the periphery, and some were concerned that it was actually too far from the center of the city. But the location of the hospital was both an economic one, but also there were ideas about a therapeutic landscape, that the siting the hospital away from the hubbub of the city was part of what would be healthy for people's sort of recovery. But what's important in this image is also has to do with the sort of development of the city and where the hospital sits in terms of urban planning. Aaron or Stacey, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just say that one of the things that comes across in a lot of the early records is when they talk about this idea of moving away from noise and commotion, which is interesting the more that we've talked about a lot of these different themes, and that whole sense of it's very much when we talk today about quiet environments for people to heal. So they were very early on looking at this idea that they wanted to make sure that the patients had the best opportunity to recuperate, and that meant removing them from a lot of this other commotion.
I would just say, well, a few things. The first thing to keep in mind with this image is that it shows the city 40 years after the establishment of the hospital. So you would think that the hospital might by this point be surrounded by development. It's clearly not. It's clearly still in the fringes of the city. In 1755, it was really in the countryside. And as Stacey was suggesting, there's a kind of therapeutic reason for that, which is that exposure to light and air and country life is thought to be good for patients or inmates in any number of institutions. There also are practical reasons for it. Land is cheaper on the periphery, and there's a general sense that noxious uses of any kind, things that people find disturbing or offensive, from industrial smells to undesirable people, should be on the edge. And it's important to remember that in its origins, both in this country and in England, hospitals were almshouses as much as anything else. So this is part of that story. Note that you really can't see the squares on this plan either. Of course, Rittenhouse and Logan are off the map, but Washington and Franklin you should be able to pick out, and you can't. So that tells you something.
Yeah, Stacey, would you mind talking just a little bit about, for those who might not know, about the difference between the hospital and the almshouse at this point in time?
So a lot of times an almshouse will eventually develop into a hospital, which would be the case with the Philadelphia Almshouse and in New York. But the difference for us is that Pennsylvania Hospital was established specifically as a medical institution. So while we took in a lot of people, particularly the mentally ill, or, you know, we had individuals who might be considered sort of, you know, undeserving individuals, but at the crux of it, we are a medical institution from the very beginning. That was solely our purpose. In our charter, it states that we are to care for the sick, poor, and the mentally ill. And so it was run a little bit differently, not so much in that sense of allowing, like, if you think about a shelter today, where individuals who might be down on their luck, or, you know, the story is, of course, the prostitutes who would find themselves getting rehabilitated at the almshouse when the weather was cold, who suddenly were perfectly fine when the spring came up. You know, this was really an institution that was specifically medical in nature. And we were very specific about that in the very beginning, including the idea that we did not wish to have anyone who was incurable coming into the institution. So that would have been both from a medical or a mental health aspect. And then also that there were no contagions allowed. And this is something that's, you know, very important throughout the history. A lot of times people think of yellow fever and they're like, oh, Pennsylvania Hospital. We have a smaller role in the yellow fever story only because we did not allow contagious individuals into the hospital. So that would primarily be the biggest difference between the two.
Thank you. Next slide. So,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Starr.
Oh, well, I was just, you can jump in as much as you'd like. I was just going to say, this is a theme that's come up a bit that I think Aaron has really pointed out, but looking at this Georgian estate model and looking at the hospital through that lens. So, you know, in my introductory set of slides, we showed the view from the south, from Pine Street of the south facade of the hospital, which has remained remarkably consistent over time. And this is kind of in keeping with a larger philosophy.
Yeah, I think we'll probably end up talking about that more when we look at the site plan. But I do think that this comparison certainly makes the visual point that there is similar thinking behind institutional design of the 18th century and elite domestic design that extends from the building to the landscape around it. And in the kind of Georgian thinking of the mid to late 18th century, you have really buildings that have two fronts, albeit one of those fronts being a kind of secondary one. In both cases now, we're looking at views of these buildings from their, what would be called their garden front. And in the case of the Woodlands, obviously it's overlooking the Schuylkill River, as it still does. You can see it from Amtrak. And in the case of the Pennsylvania Hospital, obviously you're looking onto a city street. But the kind of framing of these buildings by these artists shows you that these were very much objects in a landscape and meant to be seen that way.
Next slide. So this is sort of, this builds on this idea, these images build on that idea of the Georgian sort of the Georgian ideal, the house and the landscape, the services or functions that are visible and those that are not visible, those that are deemed appropriate for presentation or not. And what we have here, the image on the left is there is a moat around the Pine Building of the Pennsylvania Hospital that is not actually visible if you're standing on the street because it's submerged. And the purpose of that moat when it was originally built was actually to allow circulation, sort of exercise for the people who were in that lower level of those rooms. And those lower level rooms were cells for the insane, so for the mentally ill patients. And then actually I'm going to let Aaron speak to the cryptoporticus and the all-weather passage at Monticello.
So in all of these landscapes, there is a careful balance between what you see and what you don't see as a visitor or a member of the public versus someone who spent their days here voluntarily or otherwise. And to get a sense of how that worked, we might back up for a second. The historian David Rothman, whose book, The Discovery of the Asylum, is important for framing any conversation like this, pointed out in the 1970s that up until the 19th century, there was a kind of domestic model for American institutions, especially things like hospitals and almshouses. And that was carried over into the sort of social relations of the institution as well, which were thought of as a kind of extended family. So that family model in a big house, broadly speaking, is what informed the original design of the Pennsylvania Hospital. Of course, it more directly and literally also informs the designs of places like Monticello and the Woodlands. And in both of those two cases, the servants, or in the case of Monticello, the enslaved population, was kept generally out of view. This was not strictly true at Monticello, where, and in an area called Mulberry Row, you could see some activities of the enslaved at a distance, but it was certainly true when you got closer to the house. At the Woodlands, where there were indentured servants, but as far as we can tell, no slaves, nonetheless, the desire to keep the sort of service functions and serving people out of view was very strong and very kind of carefully accommodated in the design of both the house and the landscape. And I do think you see some of that going on here over at the Pennsylvania Hospital. And we refer to this zone that you see as a moat, but the word is misleading because in fact, this was always meant to be a passageway. And I think early on, it may very well have had a service function that at least complemented what Kecia was describing, the circulation of the mental hospital patients. But in both cases, the desire to keep either those patients or the people doing the sort of serving work of the institution out of view was very strong. And again, I refer to how kind of carefully balanced this equation was, because it wasn't as though the early mental patients at the Pennsylvania Hospital were never to be seen by the public. In fact, the public could pay to see them at key moments and at certain times. And so if anything, part of the idea here in the early years of the hospital was to kind of limit access to something that you would otherwise have to pay to see, that is to say, the patients themselves. So again, the control of what you can see and what you can't see is crucial to our understanding of all of these institutions. And even though they have some kind of superficially common elements, I do think that when you use this Georgian house model to explain the Pennsylvania Hospital, you have to be equally ready to see how components of that design worked differently than they might have at their private house counterparts.
Next slide, please. So here we have an image of the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital, which was part of the Pennsylvania Hospital, but a separate institute that was developed in 1841 for the mentally ill or the insane. So this is a pivotal moment in the history of the Pennsylvania Hospital, because at that moment in 1841, the insane actually occupy about 50% of the Pennsylvania Hospital's space. So mental illness and mental health gets moved into a separate institute, which is farther west in West Philadelphia, which then means that at the site of the Pennsylvania Hospital, they now have all of that space to really develop and focus on medical care apart from mental health. And it's at this point in the hospital's history that we'll see in actually, the next slide, please. The evolution and development of the back of the house, as it were, as Aaron referenced earlier on. So you have sort of the front lawn, the front face of the building, the Pennsylvania Hospital, that pine building, which is very pronounced. It's in each of those maps, but you can perhaps see it most dramatically in the 1875 map, the one in the center. So the south end is the formal front lawn. The back side, which is the north side, is the half of the site that becomes developed over time and is sort of allocated to modernization for different kinds of medical technology and needs. So it's that's a key moment in the history of the site and hospital. Next slide, please. The heating, ventilation, and circulation. This is a beautiful image. It's our poster image, but it really speaks to sort of a number of issues. One has to do with ideas of contagion and germs, and then another health, and then just modernization, sort of state-of-the-art circulation and heating for care of patients. So it's linked to health, it's linked to medicine, and then understanding of how buildings function. I know that, Aaron, you wanted to say a couple of things about this.
So I think there are really two things going on here. The older notion we've talked about light, air, and countryside being healthy is now kind of getting updated with this high-tech system of the post Civil War era that moves air through the building without daylight entering into it. This is a moment, by the way, where hospitals and medical buildings throughout the country are being designed with these kinds of systems in place. But a kind of comprehensive retrofitting like this is really an impressive and unusual thing to see. And to remind us all in the COVID era of how much this kind of work costs when you need to get a building breathing again. It's a huge undertaking. But another way of looking at it, in light of that older function of a building exposed to light and air in the countryside, is that this building couldn't be moved to the countryside. Some of its functions could be, and the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane was one of those functions. But the core hospital stays here, and in a way, this is like bringing the countryside inside the building because you can't move the whole thing out to West Philadelphia.
Next slide, please. Stacey, do you want to say a few things in terms of the hospital as it sat within some circuit of institutions that were major sites for visitation, as well as being important institutions in the city?
The tourism is something that, you know, in the beginning, I don't think we really appreciated just how much of a destination Pennsylvania Hospital was for people. But it was part of this larger group of institutions in the city that either because they were the first here or they seemed to be significant in different ways. So whether, you know, we're talking about Eastern State or Pennsylvania Hospital, there is an attraction to these institutions. And I don't think we really looked into that a lot in the past, but it's become something that we very much understand today. People who are in this neighborhood, and you can see the you know, post there from Bob Skiba, They are very interested, and they are also very committed to this institution. We are part of the neighborhood. We are part of this community. And that's true because generations of people come here and their doctors are here. And it's also true because there are people who make specific trips here. So whether we're going back further in the past and we're looking at something like, people traveling from Europe to come to see, whether it's the Benjamin West painting or they're coming to see Charles Dickens was the name I was trying to think of. It was in my head and I was like, who was that? Charles Dickens came and he viewed our Christ healing the sick in the temple. He didn't think it was as beautiful as the first version that had existed that was still in Europe, but he came here nonetheless, as well as people like Francis Scott Key, who came to the hospital when he was recuperating in Philadelphia and then wrote a poem. So there's this long history of people coming in and sort of understanding that this is a significant place for a variety of reasons. Aaron, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just briefly, and that's to say that the sort of first tourist lures of the Pennsylvania Hospital were really two things: seeing the mentally ill being treated, and seeing this painting "Christ Healing the Sick" by Benjamin West, which was on display really from 1818 to 1848, and like the admission fees charged for seeing the sort of experiment of mental healing, people were charged to see the portrait of Christ healing the sick. These are major sources of income. This is not trivial. Supposedly between 1818 and 1848, in contemporary dollars, the hospital received about $25,000 in admissions fees. So that's not small. The 1820s and 30s are really a kind of golden age in American tourism, people going to places like Niagara Falls and seeing sacred natural sites, but they're also intrigued by large-scale social experiments, which is certainly what Pennsylvania Hospital and Eastern State Penitentiary were. And there was always an element of sort of prurient curiosity to this. Seeing the population you don't otherwise get to see. But it's I think easier for us to see that and harder for us to understand the kind of excitement around the social experiment that these places were. Look, there are huge social problems and we've developed these machines for fixing them. Come and see the machines at work. Come and see the Republic itself healing itself. That was very much part of the way tourists were encouraged to think of these places, and I think to some extent did think of them.
And before we transition to the sort of next theme that we're going to discuss, I just want to reiterate how this point, or the points that we've made in this first section, are really important in terms of understanding the hospital as a site of heritage. We're here to develop a conservation management plan. And one of the things that we do with that conservation management plan is to really articulate and define what are the different values of this site. And so this process of doing historical research kind of brings these to the fore, things that may have been forgotten, because for practical purposes, people understand the hospital as a functioning hospital. I go there because I'm sick, or we have an emergency. But in fact, as we see, the hospital has been a site of visitation, a part of the sort of social experiment. People actually went there to visit it for those reasons. People have been going there to see the gardens for ages. There's a history of the hospital and medicine and medical education and art. People went there to see a great work of art. So the hospital has many facets to it. So it both has this sort of practical institutional function as a site of healing and care, which was itself part of a social experiment. And then there is the hospital as this site of heritage and history and culture. So next slide, please. Starr, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say this slide comes from, some of our initial work kind of processing this information. And it's our first stab at kind of visualizing mapping this network of institutions and ideals. And I think what's interesting and what's come up quite a bit in conversations with stakeholders and in thinking about, how this background, this history can inform the future of the hospital is that a lot of these institutions still exist around Philadelphia today. And there are many opportunities for partnerships in the present to kind of understand these overlapping themes and running themes and individuals involved and how they're manifesting throughout the city. We're running a little short, so I think maybe we can skip to the next slide.
Start.
Okay, so one of these themes is very evident in the landscape of the hospital grounds, the symbolism and the interconnectivity between botany and early medicine through materia medica and the study of plants. You have so many prominent figures kind of all engaged in this conversation. You have William Hamilton of the Woodlands, who is lending his gardens to Benjamin Smith Barton, who's teaching materia medica at the University of Pennsylvania and bringing students over to see plant specimens in these gardens. And you have these people authoring books on botany, on medicine, and working at the hospital as well. So, while we've found that there has been a fair amount of change in the landscape, even though it's, that South Lawn configuration has remained consistent over time. It's not necessarily that we're looking at a bunch of heirloom plantings, but there's a lot of symbolism embedded in the landscape that can be read. Next slide.
Stacey, do you want to mention some of the symbolic plants and their relationships to the hospital and the historic figures?
So we actually saw in the other slide the Franklinia image. So we do have a Franklinia on site at the hospital, obviously because that stands out as one of our co-founders. But we also have our Penn Treaty elm, which is obviously significant in terms of both our sort of history in our place in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania history. It is a descendant, so it is not from the original tree. It is a cutting that came later on. And then there are the wisteria that we have. That's out front. And then if you look at the Physic Gardens, Physic Garden is our modern nod to a lot of the connections in the past with our apothecaries and with using plants and herbs for medicinal purposes at the hospital. That was actually a bicentennial project. So even though the idea for it was initially brought up in 1774, there was that war and then other things happened in between. And then they actually learned that they didn't have to import everything, that they could, grow things here themselves and that the natural plants would serve the purpose as well. But this garden itself is a nod to those colonial gardens.
And I think in addition to that, with the wisteria named in part after Caspar Wistar, isn't it? And yeah. Then the Franklinia, Benjamin Franklin, and then the Physic Garden after one of the premier early surgeons at the hospital, right?
Well, they're actually separate.
Okay, excuse me.
But the other two, yes.
But the other thing that's important to mention in reference to Starr talking about, a network of institutions is that it's a network of institutions, not just as buildings themselves and institutions, but it's a network of knowledge. And so this is where you have sort of medical history crossing with botany, crossing with transatlantic trade at the time. And to be a medical student in the sort of late 18th and early 19th centuries was also to understand botany, because botany was medicine. So all of these things are linked, and that becomes really essential in understanding where the hospital sits within this knowledge network. Aaron, did you want to add something?
I think that's absolutely right. And there are, concrete connections here as well. It's not a coincidence that not only was Philadelphia a kind of a beacon of enlightenment for medicine in the colonial period, that it was also home to sort of one half of a botanical network that stretched across the Atlantic into England. And our half of that was kind of centered on Bartram's garden and the work of John Bartram and his nursery. But it very much was a transatlantic trade in seeds and plants that had a global reach. And again, that helped keep gardens like this going, both in institutions like Pennsylvania Hospital and on private estates, not just the Woodlands, but before that out at James Logan's country house, Stenton, which is still there. And that tradition of seeing horticulture as both a kind of genteel practice and a curative or instrumental practice continues right on through the first half of the 19th century. It's worth noting that there were greenhouses at Eastern State Penitentiary, that farming was encouraged on a small scale at Eastern State Penitentiary, and that both horticulture and agriculture were very much part of the program of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in the middle of the 19th century. This kind of limited exercise and exposure to nature is thought to be highly restorative to the patients. And it's part of the reason that the mental patients were moved west in the middle decades of the 19th century to get them more exposed to this stuff. The landscape drawings for Pennsylvania Hospital of the Insane are amazing because they detail these functions down to what kinds of crops are being planted.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, so here we wanted to show the current location of Christ Healing the Sick in the Temple by Benjamin West. It's sort of it's right at an employee entrance that kind of bridges the historic Pine Building and the modern hospital, and it's very large and right on display. You can go to the next slide. And kind of jumping back to something Aaron mentioned earlier, but there was a picture house specifically constructed for viewing this painting, built on site, that was aimed at generating income for the site. I think I should let Stacey or Aaron take over to talk about this a little bit more.
Take it away, Stacey.
Well, I mean, just to add to what's already been said, excuse me, is that, the idea was we received this very generous gift from Benjamin West at the Board of Managers' request. So the Board of Managers very specifically asked Benjamin West to paint something for them. So the whole purpose of having this painting was really to be used as a fundraiser, which they were very excited that he said yes, and they received it. And then they built this structure that allowed them to put it on display. They also had a miniature of West that was on display as well. And you could make your donation and you would be able to walk through. So it was very specifically used as a fundraiser for them in order to help raise money for the hospital, much like we talked about earlier with the mentally ill coming in. It was a way that they felt like they were reinvesting in, the way we would think of it today. They were reinvesting into the care of the patients. And so they used this for a very long time to, you can see there, 90,000 people came through to come view this. And they thought it was very successful because they raised enough money to actually pay for the construction. So they felt very accomplished that we not only paid for the building, but had surplus.
One other point might be worth making while this is up, and that is that if we think of Pennsylvania Hospital as kind of nested in this network of related institutions, one of those institutions is Peale's Museum, which was not far away and was ultimately one of the other great tourist attractions of the late 18th and early 19th century. And the museum function of the hospital was again shared by other institutions as well. The more you dig, the more you find there was a museum at pretty much every one of these institutions, including the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. And so it's sort of understood that museums, picture galleries, and greenhouses are all part of this sort of kit of parts that these institutions draw on and use in their own somewhat different ways, but that kit of parts is ultimately there. And if the greenhouse function has its origin in the kind of gentleman's greenhouse at a place like the Woodlands or Stenton, the museum function goes back to the kind of cabinet of curiosities that houses like these would have had in them as well.
Next slide. I love this image because it shows, you can barely see, but the caption tells you that corner of the painting up in the upper right-hand corner of the image is the Benjamin West painting, and it's been relocated to the octagonal amphitheater, so the more current surgical amphitheater that you saw in one of the earlier maps. But Stacey, you mentioned something earlier about how art played a very different function than it does today, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
So in terms of the painting?
Yeah, I think in terms of how it might have been, moved throughout the hospital and interpreted and what it meant.
Well, for this one, I was going to mention, when you see that in the corner there, if you remember that first image that it looked like, that is a 15 by 16 foot painting. So when you think of the scale of this surgical amphitheater, and that's that little corner we see there, like you can get that sense of just how grand this was after looking at that initial amphitheater that we have in the Pine Building, and how small that was, and just, how large that this is. Artwork was very, very functional in the hospital, like mostly everything within Pennsylvania Hospital was. So we do actually move it around quite a bit, and it actually does spend a number of years out at the Institute while it was out there. Then they brought it back. But was that?
Yeah, I think it was that.
Am I forgetting something?
No, that's what I was thinking of, and it feeds very well into our next slide, so we can go to the next slide. Kecia, do you want to introduce the portrait gallery?
So now we move on to, the third sort of theme that we wanted to explore in this presentation, which has to do with actually what from here, right? How do we expand the narrative of the hospital, amplify that, and then also issues of access. This has come up a lot in our stakeholder discussions. There's access to the site, access to the narrative, access to the collections, be they archival or objects. And the hospital, to Aaron's point earlier about museums, here's sort of or galleries. This is one version of it that you see on the left-hand side, which is the portrait gallery. It's just one part of the portrait gallery. And the portrait gallery consists of many of the leading figures who, most of whom were physicians or surgeons at the hospital. We use this image to actually raise the question about what are the stories that the hospital tells, be it through its building or through the faces that are presented here, its artwork again, just as we were talking about the Benjamin West painting. And the image on the right is actually to sort of remind us of the kinds of stories that have not been present and not that have not been interpreted, frankly. So the nurses on the right were part of, worked at and were trained at the Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital. Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital was founded for Black doctors and nurses who could not easily find employment at some of the hospitals that were actually in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. So, you know, this is very germane to the kinds of things that we're talking about today in terms of inclusive histories and stories. So we're really looking at expanding these narratives. So Stacey, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah.
You had the perfect segue.
So one of the things that we have talked about throughout this project is this idea of, you know, the story has always been told from the top down, right? So from the founders, from a lot of those people who left the information. They were the ones who were recorded. But what we're seeing here is that there are a lot of stories that relate to people within the hospital who maybe didn't get a portrait, right? So we've talked a lot about the matrons who were here at Pennsylvania Hospital. We've talked about nurses. We've talked about laundresses. There are a lot of people that we may not have a huge amount of information, but that these are people who long-term have made huge contributions. I'm just going through the records. There are a couple women who were employed by the hospital who were here for 30 and 40 years. One of them began in 1790. I mean, think about being in this institution for 40 years and your date of employment was in 1790. The changes that you've seen. So we really want to explore more of those stories. We want to explore the fact that there have been, you know, all sorts of people of color and ethnicity here as patients, and there were people who were working here that we need to sort of move into some of those stories. But again, it's not to diminish anything that's happened with, you know, gentlemen who have their portraits on the wall. They made huge contributions and kept the hospital going. And we wouldn't have any of those other stories if we didn't have that as well. So they kind of go hand in hand and they complement each other. And it doesn't have to be an all one or all the other, but it's that just elevating some of those other stories that we haven't had the opportunity to talk about. So that discussion around changing the narrative is going to be something that we're definitely going to do moving forward. And I can say, you know, I have been here for 20 years, and this project has made such a huge impact, I think, on the way we think about the institution and really letting us know there's a lot of things that we didn't know. And you would think after all these years and how many times people have studied and gone through these books, but a lot of times when you're specifically looking for a thing, you miss the other things. And now what we're doing is going back and we're looking at all of the things. And so you're kind of, there's so much involved with that. I also just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about that idea of hospital as museum and our you know, sort of connection to museum. And it's something that the people who have been at this institution, I'm going to say up until probably around the bicentennial, this was a functional institution. The collections were functional for people. The artwork was functional for people. Things moved, they were fluid, things changed. When we started a pathology museum, a pathological museum that had a lot of, you know, specimens and skeletons and things, they really wanted to sort of keep that going, but they realized that that really wasn't the focus of the institution, and they, you know, sort of sent away most of the collection for that. And so that idea, that tension of all of the things that we've talked about, right? So the idea of being a museum or not being a museum, the idea of our connection to other organizations, right? So places like the College of Physicians, certainly. All of that sort of, you know, comes together now when we're talking about moving forward with the stories and the information and the accessibility that we have here, both in terms of the Pine Building and the collections and the representation.
Next slide, please. So we don't have to dwell on this, but these were some historic photos that Stacey found in the hospital archives of the nurses. And the nurses whose stories, frankly, have not often been interpreted, but were essential to the functioning of the hospital and to the evolution of the hospital as an institution. Next slide, please. Stacey?
My favorite topic. This is access to healthcare, right? So I talk about this a lot when we have tours, and particularly when we have students come in. And, you know, if you look at the image of the gentleman who had this tumor on his face, and people always think, well, why would you let it get that big? Why wouldn't you go to the doctor sooner? But if, you know, this, I think they had mentioned in the record that this grew over a period of about 20 years on this man. And so the surgery is actually going to take place in like 1804, 1805. And so when you're looking at that and you're thinking, why didn't he just come to the doctor? It's very relevant to the same conversations we have today. Why don't people go to the doctor? Well, what is your employment status? Do you have time to take off? Even though the hospital was designed for individuals to receive care free of charge, it still meant that if you needed to come in and have surgery, you were going to be out of work for a period of time. Can your family afford that? And then there's just the general fear around coming into this institution. It again was a top-down organization. So the managers and the physicians made the rules, and perhaps you're uncomfortable with that, or maybe it's just too scary and too foreign to you to think, oh my gosh, I have to go in here and they're gonna just tell me what to do. So there's a lot of what is happening today that you can relate to this, and help people to understand, you know, even today when people come in and they're like, well, why wouldn't someone go to the doctor? There's a bigger story to that, and understanding each of these individual stories and having empathy for those people is something that we do try to convey. And even though it's using this one patient, I think it can speak broadly to that idea of, you know, these are ongoing issues, and there's no separation between everything historically from the modern. You can find all these connections together.
The relevance of the histories is a through line, right? The particularities may differ from era to era, but there is a consistent relevance. The history doesn't just sit back there, right?
Yeah. I was just going to add, you know, thinking back to when we were looking at the portrait gallery, that's something that's come up very much with stakeholders, is the public expectation around how you're talking about these histories is shifting too. And there's just so many opportunities through the hospital to engage in really rich discussions about, you know, the context around these histories and how they carry through to today and what's happening in medicine today. And that's definitely something that we hope to emphasize through this process too.
And not to be too grotesque about things, but people may be wondering what the image in the center is, and it's actually the tumor.
That is the real tumor. Absolutely. So you can see, yep, that one right there, right into that jar. So when I was talking about the Pathological Museum, there were certain specimens that they had on display and certain ones that they saved because they felt they were significant. So this tumor was actually removed right upstairs in the Surgical Amphitheater. So for anyone who's been up there when that room was actually in use, and the physician was Dr. Philip Singh Physic. So father of American surgery. So they felt that this was something that they definitely wanted to hang on to.
Right, and the Pathology Museum was very much used at the time for teaching purposes.
Correct. Student instruction, absolutely. But, you know, sort of when they decided to dissolve it, I think the idea was that there were other institutions. So again, our connection to other places, that they would be able to still have an opportunity to learn from these materials, but that we didn't have to support it here.
Right. I think a fair portion of the pathology specimens went to the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and then there are some that we're not really quite sure where they sent everything to. It seemed they just sort of said, we're done with it. Somebody take it.
Well, before we open it up for discussion, did any of the panelists have anything that they wanted to add that they felt we missed? We're good? Okay. So maybe now we'll open it up. I don't know if people had additional questions that they'd like to ask. I'm not sure if questions have come up.
I haven't seen any come in, but if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the question and answer.
I realized that we didn't say, I don't think we said when the hospital was actually built, did we?
So 1755, 56 is the first wing. One thing that I had wanted to point out is that first wing, the east wing, has sort of the DNA of the whole thing in it, in its design and early use. The part of it that fronts 8th Street is considered the sort of administrative front of it, and inside were, inside of this thing were wards, as you would expect, including in the basement, the zone for mental hospital patients, and I think it was men above on the first floor and women on the second floor. And one of the kind of interesting things about this site is the way, kind of from that building, you can keep on seeing the functions that are in there accommodated in later sections as more specialized spaces. So all of it sort of together in a microcosm there in the East Wing with its so-called terminal building, and then growing steadily westward. But again, the sort of underlying conception of this whole thing as it grows is that of a kind of a Georgian building, conceived in 3 parts, with the central building being the last piece to be completed in 1805. So the time span of construction is 1755 to 1805 for the original core of this. And in a way, that's not so different from the way a building like the US Capitol grows, also conceived of as a kind of country house on a large scale with a central section that gets added as the last part of it. There's a lot of common design thinking in these projects.
So I saw a question pop up that asked about tours. In non-COVID times, yes, we do provide tours, and we're hoping to provide them again, possibly in the fall. So we're looking around the October timeframe. What you would do is you would contact me. So I oversee the tours program. So you would call my office, and then we would schedule you for a tour. I do have 3 other tour guides who work with me. Tours are generally about an hour, and we do go into the center building primarily. So it would be the Great Court area, which you saw the image of, up to the Historic Library, and then up to the Surgical Amphitheater. And we do, in nice weather, have a little tour of the outside. So you get to see the Physic Garden and the William Penn statue out front. And we talk a little bit about things out there. So I'm going to piggyback that to another question that popped up about what surprised you. So how many buildings that do not exist today existed in the past is what I find the most interesting. And I tie that into the tours because now I feel a a great deal of energy around this idea of, sort of reformatting our tours and incorporating much more of this information that we have learned from all of the work that we've been doing with the CMP into the tours, which will be more extensive for the grounds, and then also for some of the interior things that we have learned and that we've talked about. So I combined both of those. But if you do want a tour, we will eventually have them again, and you would just call me, and then I could make those arrangements.
So I'd like to address a question that has come up specifically about the utility of the CMP and the conservation management plan regarding, will we have recommendations for implementation, and how will the CMP guide future development? And it's an excellent question because it gets to the heart of what the purpose of the CMP is. So as we have sort of presented today, part of the process of developing the CMP is to do the kind of background research to understand what are the values that are embodied within the site, what are the elements of the site that sort of most significantly sort of represent those values, and which are the things that can tolerate change, to what degree, and the things, the objects, the buildings or spaces, and which are more, which can tolerate more change and which should not actually be changed. So for example, in our process, we have identified that that front lawn is a space that has always been there, that is part of this sort of visual identity of the hospital. It's not just the lawn itself, but it's the fact that there is that space in front of the building. That's part of the urban morphology and how people experience what the hospital is as a site in the city. There is the Pine building itself, which has not changed significantly over time. The interior arrangement of spaces a bit, but it has always been recognized as a significant sort of functioning, sort of working building, but also a symbolic, kind of iconic face to the hospital. So we will, in our process, identify what are the material elements that should be preserved for the long term, and spaces, which things are, if there are elements that actually need repair or significant maintenance cycles, we will identify those things. We will also talk about interpretation, which clearly is a big element of presenting what the values of the hospital are. And that gets to the issue of access as well, because the more people understand what the values of the hospital are, the more they will be invested in it. The more people are invested in it, then the sort of the longer kind of future you can ensure for it. So that has both a public outreach aspect to it, as well as an internal public, which is the hospital, the people who use the hospital, the people who work there, the people who come as patients. So there are many different levels at which we will present recommendations. I hope that answers the question.
So 2 questions that came up. There is a deer that is in the Hart Memorial Garden. That statue was actually located at the Institute as part of the Pleasure Garden. So that was brought over here when the Institute was sold. And then Dr. Kearney, you may use anything you like, specifically any of the Pennsylvania Hospital images. And then some of the other ones, I think there's a couple public access, and anything you need, we can get to you. So we're happy to do that.
I'll grab the question about connections to the Bartram world, and I'll say forthrightly that I don't know them in detail, and I would love to be able to tap my friend and colleague Joel Fry, curator of Bartram's Garden, to elaborate on it. But I will say that certain people stand out as a part of the kind of connection or connective tissue between the two. John Fothergill, who's anatomical crayon drawings were really important to the early teaching and tourism, actually, at Pennsylvania Hospital. Is a bridge figure. So is Benjamin Smith Barton. And a lot of this connectivity also runs through the APS, the American Philosophical Society, where ideas about medicine and nature and materia medica are constantly being exchanged. So that, I realize that's partly a punt, but that's at least some pins to put into that as you think about it going forward.
There was another question about patients and where did the patients come from? Patients would have come from the region just like they do now. So Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware are going to be where most of the people came from. But then we also had a very large amount of sailors who came to the hospital. And that sort of maritime connection is something we didn't really get into here. That could be for a whole other discussion. But we had a lot of connections to captains of ships, and there were a lot of sailors who ended up coming to the hospital to receive treatment as well, and they would have been from everywhere. Now, in the records for admission and discharges that list all the patients, they did record where people came from or where they're identified, right? So if you were coming from a ship somewhere, they most likely would have recorded the ship name. And then specifically for you, what was your country of origin? So you may have been on, a French ship, but if you were really from Belgium, they would have written that you were from Belgium.
Stacey, is it true that at least in the early years, when it came to treating the poor, they drew the line at New Jersey? That there were sort of early rules about taking only from Pennsylvania?
They do have people who came in from New Jersey. In order to get our charter, they had to make sure that they were open to everybody in Pennsylvania. But we still did have other people from New Jersey coming in. Maybe they all weren't supposed to. We had a couple yellow fever patients who snuck in the back door too. So I think that if the physicians knew of someone, and we did have connections to some New Jersey doctors, they would allow them to come in. Pennsylvania is the largest in the very, very beginning of patients coming in. But that stretches, out to Carlisle and Lancaster, that whole area. So it was a broad net that they cast, but they had to do that in order to receive the charter.
Stacey?
Yes.
There's a specific question about, did the hospital have any special role during the Civil War, and how much of the hospital existed at that time?
So at that point, it would have been all three sections of the Pine Building that are still in existence today. The laboratory and the picture house would have been at that point. And yeah, so not the new surgical, no, not the new surgical building. So our relation to the Civil War is that we actually were known as a center for surgical excellence at that point. And so we had a contract with the government to receive so many soldiers, and specifically so many very specifically wounded surgical patients. So we had about 24 of those patients come. And I think in total, we treated about 100 patients, but that was sort of the official connection. Now, in terms of other material that's sort of interesting is that the mentally ill patients, there were a large number of patients from the South who were patients at the Institute. And when the war broke out, they were not able to send payment for their family members, because while Pennsylvania Hospital and when the mentally ill were here at Pennsylvania Hospital, we did have a very large number of poor patients, so people who were not paying their care, who were mentally ill. The Institute becomes a little bit more posh. So there are a lot more paying patients and a lot of individuals who were sent there because of Dr. Kirkbride's use of privacy. He did not believe that people should be stigmatized for seeking mental health treatment. And so his confidentiality inspired people to send their relations there. So we had a lot of people come up from the South. And in the Board of Manager Records, it is something known as the Southern debt. And what they talk about is the fact that all of these Southern families could not afford to send payment for their relatives. And the Board of Manager really struggles with this because they're, you know, what do we do? Do we just let the people go? Do we keep them in the Institute? Like, how do we handle it? And they finally decided they were going to leave everybody where they were and they were going to see what happens. When the war ends, the Board of Managers sends a representative down to the South to basically start knocking on doors, I think, and saying like, hey, you owe us money. And what happens is that when that gentleman gets back and reports to the board, he tells them, don't worry about it. You can't imagine how devastated it is there. You know, they pretty much were just going to write off the debt. And I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of about $35,000 that they hadn't received. And so they, you know, kind of were like, okay, but then people started to actually send money again, and they were relieved by that. So that was another section involving the Civil War. And then lastly, Pennsylvania Hospital from 1825 until 1922 recorded the weather every single day. And it was usually the apothecary's job to go through and to record this information. So we have meteorological records for, you know, almost that 100-year time span. And one of the things that is recorded in there are the events of the Civil War. And so the apothecary would write these notes down the bottom, and he would talk a little bit about, you know, what was in the news. He talks very specifically about the city, meaning Philadelphia itself, ready to make a firm stand should the rebels get through from Gettysburg. So that was in there. They talk about Lincoln's assassination. They talk about when Lincoln's funeral procession came through the city. So they were all things that were related to the Civil War that were part of the collections. I know that was a lot, sorry.
But it really speaks to the point that the hospital is this, so many stories and histories can be told through the hospital. You know, it's connected to the Civil War history. It's connected to, as we've talked about, botanical history, transatlantic trade, you know, financial models of how hospitals supported themselves. The economics of the hospital was tied to art. It was tied to the mental health patients, the therapeutic landscapes. So it becomes really important in terms of our next steps and interpretation and partnerships with other institutions, historic institutions that are still very much part of the fabric of Philadelphia today. Right?
Do we have time for this one last question that came in about in the picture of surgeons performing surgery in the amphitheater, they weren't wearing masks. When did that change? I feel like Stacey will have a good answer from that.
Well, they didn't wear them in the beginning, right? So nobody understood germs. And that was something that would have come later. So that image, what did we say that was? Was that the?
It's in the octagonal
that was?
Clinical hall, so somewhere between 1870 and 1896 or so.
Okay, so I would say probably not too far afterward they may have begun wearing masks, but not at that point.
I think, you know, one of the things I've found most fascinating working on this project, and especially trying to track the evolution of the campus through the buildings and the uses of the buildings, is how little gets saved. Like, it's amazing that you know, the first of everything was recognized as important enough to remain. And we're thankful for that. But there are so many successive buildings that, you know, I think the first surgical amphitheater, was used for maybe 60 years or so, and then a new one is built, and it's only used for about 30 years before a new one is built. And, you know, they come along with these grand announcements about all of the, you know, shiny new features that they have, steam cleaning, and it just tracks the evolution and understanding of germs and disease transmission and sanitation. And it's very cool. It's too bad they're not there, but then you understand why they're not there, because a hospital can't keep old buildings around. So.
And that's one of the things I think is most remarkable when you look at the Pine Building and you see how much of the structure is here, now knowing that everything behind us that existed is gone, and just how important it is for this building that it has always been in use. Which is something I know we've all talked a lot about, and that idea of this continuous use of this building. And for whatever reason, its function was always able to sort of shift enough to make it still viable, whereas, you know, some of the other buildings were taken down. They needed to be changed, they needed to be upgraded. It was easier to take that down.
So to that point, I guess I would say one of the most interesting things from an architectural history and landscape history perspective is sort of to follow up on what Starr was saying, discovering how much really was there in the backyard on the Spruce Street side. And even though that's where the most change has occurred, I think from a historical research standpoint, at least from a landscape research standpoint, that's where a lot of the most interesting discoveries may yet be made. I don't hold out much hope for archaeology there because it's been so dug up, but there clearly are interesting historical layers back there. And yeah, you know, hospitals are like museums and airports and, you know, other kinds of buildings that are constantly growing and constantly changing. Hospitals, museums, airports, you can think of a slew of others. And, you know, these are almost hard to contain within a single building envelope. They're changing so rapidly. And so it is amazing that the south face of this has been kept as intact as it has, kind of as the opposite number to the north side, which is just constantly changing behind the scenes.
And there's another conservation question, and I'm partial to the conservation questions. And someone asked about if there are any aspects of the building, and I think we're talking about the Pine Building really, that are in any parts of the building that are in dire need of repair or conservation. And I would say that for the most part, what is quite remarkable about the Pine Building is how well it has been cared for, which speaks to a sort of consciousness about the importance of the building over centuries. Of course, there are some repairs to tend to, as with any building, and that maintenance needs to be cyclical and therefore regular. There are, to the point that I mentioned earlier in terms of access to the narrative, access to the site, access to the collections. The hospital is quite unusual in its archive collection. You know, it has this massive archive of its history, and it's in situ, it is in place. This is a bit unusual. And so Stacey, who can speak to this better than any of us sitting here, who is sort of the caretaker and steward, the curator of this archive, I would say that is one element that we really would like to try and advance, which is proper care and storage for the archive so that scholars and others can actually access it. This is part of what constitutes the value and heritage of that site and institution. Stacey, I don't know if you want to add to that.
So in terms of that, that's really about sort of some of the environmental issues here. So I don't want people to think that we have stuff like, you know, just out anywhere. They're in archival folders, they're in archival boxes, so they're cared for in that sense. But there are certain parts of the environment, particularly HVAC issues, that we definitely want to address. And then also just for certain materials that, you know, there could be upgraded sort of ways to hold some of these objects that I think would be beneficial to us. In terms of accessibility, that is something definitely that we are talking about. You know, we have talked about the idea of, you know, digitizing some material. There are certain restrictions that we have to abide by. So, you know, we just have to be careful with that. But then also accessibility in the sense of having people be able to come here and know more about the collections that we have here. So there are large groups of people who know, but not everybody. So trying to get that out there a little bit and to work with other institutions who have been doing really great jobs and giving us a better presence online, which is something that we have talked a lot about in terms of, you know, updating the website so that people can see a little bit better what it is that we have here and, you know, make those connections that we have talked about in terms of the other institutions and, you know, the longevity of the institution and how it touches all of these different aspects. You know, so art and healthcare and, you know, all of that all wrapped up to present that to people in a better package than what we're doing right now.
And Stacey, there was another very interesting question in terms of fundraising schemes. And someone asked if live concerts have ever been part of the fundraising activities at the hospital.
As far as I understand, I don't think we've ever had any sort of live concerts. For many, many years in the middle of the 20th century, they used to do sort of these fundraisers in the park. So they used to go over to Washington Square Park and they would have Pennsylvania Hospital Day and they would raise money for the hospital. And there would be shows on occasion that were put on by a lot of the hospital employees, particularly the doctors and nurses who would put these little shows together, but no concerts as far as I can remember.
Well, we've gone on for a bit and it is a Saturday and it is beautiful out here if you happen to be in Philadelphia. So we are very appreciative of all of those who've attended because we love the topic. But we hope that you've learned something and that you will actually come, if you live in Philadelphia, that you will come and visit the hospital. And we really look forward to helping advance some of those sort of interpretation narratives and partnerships that Stacey mentioned and that we've talked about. And if you do have further questions, you should feel free to contact any one of us. And if you don't have our email, I think if you reach out to Liz Mayers, who sent you all the link, she can channel you to all of us. Oh, there you go. Please feel free to send questions too. It's in the chat. So thank you, everyone.